Good afternoon. I'm Josephine Nalbantaglu, the Associate Provost of Grad Education and the Dean of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies. We are very pleased to welcome you to this year's Tomlinson Talks. This event has been organized to honor Dr. Richard H. Tomlinson and his generous contributions to graduate research at McGill University. We have planned what we are sure to be a memorable showcase of the exceptional research that Tomlinson Scholars are doing. We were unable to move forward with the already planned physical event for Tomlinson Talks in April 2020. We put them off for a while, but now we decided to pursue a virtual format for April 2021. And we invited back the Tomlinson Scholars whose research could not be showcased last year. Many of us, including our scholars, are virtually joining the talks today from many different places. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and bring into this virtual space some qualities of the physical space on which McGill University is located. We acknowledge that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet. In the past, the Tomlinson talks were filmed, and we were very pleased to present them to Dr. Tomlinson to thank him for his support and commitment to graduate studies. On January 28, 2018, Dr. Tomlinson passed away at the age of 94, leaving behind a remarkable legacy of generosity to McGill University and its students. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Dr. Tomlinson and why he chose to do what he did for graduate education at McGill. Dr. Richard Tomlinson graduated from McGill with a PhD in chemistry in 1948 under the supervision of Otto Maass. He held postdoctoral fellowships at the National Research Council in Ottawa and at Cambridge University. In 1950, he joined the Department of Chemistry at McMaster University in Hamilton, where he served as chair and professor emeritus. He was also the founding director of Genome Corporation, which became a major manufacturer of microchips for digital signal processing, as well as the world's largest supplier of microchips for hearing aids. Dr. Tomlinson made numerous gifts to McGill. One of these was the Tomlinson Doctoral Fellowship. So what are these? These were created 2 decades ago, actually, in 2000. He created the Dr. Richard H. Tomlinson Fellowship Program. The Tomlinson Fellowships are $35,000 per year, and about a dozen new awards are given out each year, and about 18 fellows exist every year. And the funding is provided for up to 3 years. This is really a significant contribution to allowing us to recruit and support exceptional graduate students. So these are given to students who are arriving to McGill from outside the university. This was really a very significant gift to McGill because in 2000, the total gift of $64 million was the largest gift ever made in support of higher education in Canada at the time. And the aim was really to attract high caliber students to McGill. This prestigious program fosters exceptional graduate scholarship at one of Canada's leading research-intensive universities. The fellowship is open to all faculties, and we will be hearing the showcasing of the research being done in many different faculties today. So the establishment of the fellowship in 2000, the Tomlinson Talks have been really a recurring event to showcase the excellence of graduate research at McGill. Today, you'll be hearing from 4 Tomlinson scholars from a range of disciplines. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment now to present you a brief video in Dr. Tomlinson's memory. Please join me in celebrating his life achievements as well as his generous contributions to McGill University. We play that video almost every year since his death, and we have, it's always a very moving moment for us. Now I would like to introduce our moderator for the Tomlinson Talks. I'm very pleased to welcome Ian Strachan, the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies in the Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Studies. He's been part of the Tomlinson Talks as the event moderator for many, many years. I would like Ian to say a few words about the Tomlinson Talks before we hear from our scholars.
Thank you, Joe. The 4 Tomlinson scholars you are going to hear from today have been working hard to prepare their presentations in a challenging format. They each have 20 slides, timed to show for 20 seconds each. That's 6 minutes and 40 seconds total to showcase the contributions of their research. At the end of the 4 presentations, there will be a question and answer period. You can submit your questions for the presenters through the web form link shown on the screen, as well as in the video description of this live stream. Our first presenter is Alvi Rahman, a third-year PhD student in epidemiology with a specialization in pharmacoepidemiology. Previously, he completed an MSc in epidemiology at the University of Ottawa and subsequently worked as a clinical research coordinator in the Canadian Inherited Metabolic Diseases Research Network. His current research focuses on drug safety and effectiveness in neurology and cardiovascular medicine. He also has a particular interest in the assessment of drug-drug interactions. Alvi is also a recipient of the CIHR Frederick Banting and Charles Best Canada Graduate Scholarship. Alvi.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'd like to give you a brief overview of my PhD thesis topic. So to start off, I'd like to introduce Jane, who is a 66-year-old woman diagnosed with atrial fibrillation. This is a condition characterized by an irregular heartbeat, which can cause impeded blood flow. As a result, this may lead to the formation of blood clots, which can then travel to the brain and potentially cause a stroke. Patients like Jane are typically treated with a class of drugs called oral anticoagulants or blood thinners, which prevent the formation of blood clots and reduce the risk of stroke. However, these drugs also impair the body's ability to heal blood vessel injury, which can result in major bleeding or hemorrhage. Major bleeding is the most frequent and serious complication of oral anticoagulant therapy. Important types include gastrointestinal bleeding or intracranial hemorrhage, both of which can be fatal. Therefore, this is a serious consideration for physicians treating patients with oral anticoagulants. So there are 2 types of oral anticoagulants. The first are called vitamin K antagonists, or VKAs, and these are an older, less expensive type, which includes the commonly known drug warfarin. Their effectiveness and associated risk of bleeding can vary by interactions with food, supplements, and other drugs, and they require regular blood test monitoring. The second type of anticoagulants are called direct oral anticoagulants, or DOACs. These are new and they were developed over the last decade. They have fewer dietary and drug interactions, and as a result, they do not require regular blood test monitoring. The use of DOACs has markedly increased recently compared with VKAs. So now let's say Jane has been treated for 1 year, and now she's been diagnosed with depression. Her physician will now prescribe her with antidepressant medications to manage her condition. This is a relatively common occurrence, as approximately 16% of patients using VKAs are diagnosed with anxiety, depression, or both. Among antidepressants, the most commonly prescribed are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. They are preferred over other classes of antidepressants since they are as effective and have fewer side effects. They may be used to treat a number of different conditions, including depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, or migraine. So now you might be asking yourself, how are SSRIs related to major bleeding? As you may know, platelets are key cells in the blood clotting process. They accumulate at the site of blood vessel injury and release a hormone called serotonin, which further amplifies blood clotting. After performing its function, serotonin is reclaimed back into the platelets using a protein called serotonin reuptake transporter. As their name suggests, SSRIs block this transporter and prevent the reuptake of serotonin. Over time, this reduces serotonin content in the platelets and impairs the blood clotting process, which can potentially result in major bleeding. And this has been found in many studies as well. So it has then been hypothesized that taking SSRIs and oral anticoagulants together may increase the risk of bleeding to a greater extent than using these drugs alone. But it's not clear by how much the risk would increase, and this would be very important information for physicians in order to prescribe these drugs safely to patients who need both of them. A potential mechanism by which these drugs may interact involves the cytochrome P450 isoenzymes found in the liver. These enzymes metabolize oral anticoagulants. SSRIs can in fact impede these isoenzymes, which may prevent the metabolism and elimination of oral anticoagulants, thus prolonging their effect. So that then brings us to our research question. What is the risk of major bleeding in patients who are concurrently using SSRIs and oral anticoagulants? Secondary objectives of this research would be to quantify the risk of bleeding in important patient groups according to sex, age, or type of oral anticoagulant taken. To conduct this research, we will use the Clinical Practice Research Data Link. This is a primary care electronic medical records database in the United Kingdom, and it includes over 35 million patients from more than 700 general practices. It records demographic and lifestyle information like BMI or smoking. It records prescriptions, referrals, diagnoses, as well as hospitalizations. To conduct this study, we will assemble a cohort of patients newly diagnosed with atrial fibrillation. These patients will then be followed to assess their use for SSRIs or oral anticoagulants, as well as for hospitalization for major bleeding. We will then compare the risk of major bleeding in patients who use these drugs concurrently to those using them alone. In order to identify patient groups in whom treatment should be tailored, the risk will also be estimated according to age and sex, type of oral anticoagulant, duration of use, as well as whether the patient has a history of major bleeding. We'll also be looking at the risk of bleeding in specific anatomical locations like gastrointestinal bleeding or intracranial hemorrhage. This type of research, which is conducted among patients in the general population, it falls within the field of pharmacoepidemiology. Pharmacoepidemiology seeks to evaluate the risks and benefits of medications as they are used in routine practice, with routine practice really being the key term here, as these drugs are typically developed in clinical trial settings. Clinical trials have certain limitations. They tend to be conducted over a short period of time with a small sample of patients, which makes it difficult to study rare side effects. These studies also tend to be less generalizable as they're conducted in highly specialized settings where patients are more adherent to medications than in real life, and they tend to exclude important populations, like patients who have multiple chronic illnesses, for example. Lastly, it may not be ethical to conduct certain studies using a clinical trial. For example, you wouldn't randomize patients who require antidepressants to receive them or not. This wouldn't be ethical. So in conclusion, this study can quantify the risk of major bleeding in patients like Jane. In addition, the results of the secondary analysis will be of particular interest. In Jane's case, a physician may decide to tailor treatment depending on whether she has a history of bleeding based on her sex, how long she should be treated, or whether the dose needs to be adjusted. So lastly, I'd like to acknowledge everyone who's had a contribution to my project. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Richard H. Tomlinson for his kind and generous donation, which has greatly supported my doctoral training. I'd like to acknowledge the guidance I've received thus far from my supervisors, Dr. Robert Platt and Dr. Christelle Renew. And also I'd like to thank all of my professors, mentors, and colleagues at the Department of Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Occupational Health, and also at the Lady Davis Research Institute at the Jewish General Hospital for all of their support and encouragement. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Kevin Moore from Earth and Planetary Sciences. Kevin graduated from York University in 2015 with a Bachelor of Science in Space Science and completed his Master of Science in Physics and Astronomy at York in 2017. He is now a third-year PhD student, and his research focuses on the habitability of extrasolar planets, specifically the presence of water on Earth-like planets orbiting red dwarf stars. Kevin hopes his research will contribute to the ambitious search for life elsewhere in the universe. Kevin.
Okay, so hi, my name is Kevin Moore. I'm a third-year PhD student here at McGill in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department, and I'm here today to talk to you about the results of my ongoing PhD research project, which involves trying to determine the habitability of Earth-like planets orbiting M-dwarf stars, depending on their surface water inventories. Now, Earth is the only planet in the universe that we know that has both confirmed liquid surface water and life as we know it. And because of that, Earth is our current template for a habitable planet. Now, you'll notice that Earth not only has abundant surface water, but it also has exposed continents on its surface. So this surface is not only important for biological processes, it's also geologically important as well. And the fact that Earth has both land and ocean on its surface allows it to regulate the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to keep the climate in the nice temperate regime that life has evolved to be so fond of, and maintain this nice temperate climate for life over very long time scales. And so you can have various different surface water regimes on a planet. So as I mentioned already, an Earth-like planet has both exposed continents and oceans on its surface. A water world will be completely covered in water with no exposed continents. And a dry dune planet will have less than about one Earth ocean on its surface, but it's still in about a habitable regime. And although we orbit the sun, which is a G-dwarf star, most stars in the universe are actually M-dwarfs. And so from a sheerly statistical standpoint, it seems like the best place to be looking for habitable rocky worlds isn't around sun-like stars, but would actually be around M-dwarfs. And so we can compare the much more abundant M-dwarfs with the sun. So this figure on the left shows that M-dwarfs are much smaller and much less luminous than the sun. However, they emit significantly more radiation than the sun at all wavelengths, and especially they emit significant radiation early in their lifetimes. And so this radiation will bombard any orbiting planets. The habitable zone around a star is the orbital region where liquid surface water can exist on a planet. And so the habitable zone around M-dwarf stars is much, much closer than the habitable zone in our own solar system. And in fact, the habitable zone around the Trappist-1 system is much, much closer. The entire orbits are inside the orbit of Mercury. And so this combination of close orbits plus loss of radiation means that this high energy radiation can rip apart water molecules high in the atmospheres of these orbiting rocky planets and drive their loss to space, sometimes even completely desiccating the surface of water. And so for the rest of this talk, I will refer to Earth-like planets orbiting M-dwarf stars as M-Earths. Now, Earth has active plate tectonics, and that is great because that means Earth is able to cycle water between its interior and surface reservoirs. And so we're really concerned with the two arrows on here, so I will explain those. So water is degassed from the interior, the mantle, to the surface through mid-ocean ridge volcanism. And at these mid-ocean ridges is also where crust is created. And so this ocean crust gradually travels to the right towards the subduction zone. And as it does, it incorporates water into its structure. Eventually, this hydrated slab of crust reaches the subduction zone and is subducted into the Earth, returning water from the interior back into the surface, from the surface back into the interior. So that leads us to our research questions. We want to know if M-Earths can retain a surface ocean while they're losing water to space. We want to know if these planets lose all of their surface water, if their surface becomes desiccated, will they be able to recover a surface ocean from water that's been hidden away in the mantle? And finally, we want to know how common are these planets with both exposed land and oceans, since that provides the ideal climate regulation on Earth. And so as far as this study is concerned, we're concerned with liquid surface water as a proxy for habitability. So if a planet has surface water, we say it's habitable. And so we can investigate all of these research questions using a model. And so we model the evolution of the M-Earth. We can model the M-Earth as two boxes, an interior reservoir, the mantle, and a surface reservoir. And we allow water to cycle between the two. We also allow water to be lost to space directly from the surface for simplicity for now, just to get an idea of the magnitude that loss will have on the surface water inventory of these M-Earths. And so the right shows a simulation result of the amount of water in the surface and mantle reservoirs over time. And so this planet begins Earth-like. And since the loss time scale is very short, where that dotted line, vertical line is, this planet loses some of its water, but it is able to retain a surface ocean. And so it remains in an Earth-like regime. Now, if we make the loss time scale significantly longer, so loss happens for much longer, this planet, although it begins in an Earth-like regime, now becomes desiccated shortly after 1 billion years. So there's no more surface water. This planet has evolved from being habitable into being an uninhabitable, desiccated planet. Now, if we very slightly tweak the parameters so that the loss is more substantial but happens for a shorter period of time, then this planet again begins Earth-like. It again becomes desiccated. However, it has enough water stored in the mantle that it is able to recover. So water is degassed from the mantle back to the surface, and this planet recovers from being in an uninhabitable regime back into being in the habitable dune regime. And so if we run a series of models and simulations for various water inventories and loss rates, we can see how the surface water inventories will result at the end of these simulations. And so planets can stay in their regime, or they could evolve across regimes. For example, you have an Earth-like planet losing enough water to become a dune planet, or even completely becoming desiccated. And we're right now working on improving the water loss calculations to make the loss more accurate. So we do this by including models of the host M dwarf to calculate the radiation impinging on the top of the atmospheres of these planets. And we also calculate the vertical structure of the atmosphere to get the temperature and pressure at each altitude and to determine how much water is at each location and available to escape. And in the future, we hope that our model results will be able to not only guide future observations, since observing time is very limited, but also interpret observations. For example, maybe spectra from the James Webb Space Telescope, which will give us an atmospheric signature, and then maybe we can tie that in to the presence of surface water on these planets. So I'd like to thank the Tomlinson Talks organizers for organizing all of this. I'd also like to thank my comprehensive exam committee, and especially my supervisor, Nick Cowan, for all the help they provided over the past couple of years. And I'd like to acknowledge funding from both the Richard H. Tomlinson Doctoral Fellowship and from the NSERC PGSD. Thank you for listening, and I would be happy to take your questions.
Our next presenter is Georgia Sulis. Georgia received her medical degree in 2011 and specialized in infectious and tropical diseases in 2017 in Italy. During this time, she conducted clinical and epidemiological research primarily focused on tuberculosis and its co-infection with HIV, in collaboration with several international partners, including the World Health Organization. She subsequently enrolled in McGill's epidemiology program for her PhD. As a doctoral candidate, she has continued working on tuberculosis while also embracing new research interests. Of note, her PhD thesis project has addressed the problem of inappropriate antibiotic use in low and middle-income countries, with a particular focus on India. Georgia successfully passed her PhD oral defense in March 2021 and will shortly begin her new appointment as postdoctoral researcher at McGill. Georgia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for having me here today. I am a recent graduate from McGill's PhD program in epidemiology under the supervision of Dr. Madhaprapai. I'm very happy to present the results of my research on the abuse of antibiotics in low and middle income countries. Antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, is a huge public health emergency worldwide. It is estimated that by 2050, about 10 million deaths will occur each year due to drug-resistant infections, for a cumulative cost of $100 trillion in terms of healthcare expenses and productivity losses. Antibiotic use in human medicine is one of the key drivers of resistance. The overuse of antibiotics, as well as their misuse, that is, the inadequate choice of treatments, represent particularly serious threats as they make the emergence and spread of resistance easier and faster. Global trends in antibiotic consumption look concerning and are mostly driven by the steep rise in low and middle income countries. Most antibiotics are used in primary care, and particularly in outpatient services. But the truth is that we still don't know much about what happens in these specific settings. During my PhD, I conducted 3 studies around this issue. First, I reviewed the literature on antibiotic prescribing practices in primary care. Then I examined antibiotic overuse, adopting a novel approach. And finally, I assessed the impact of the current pandemic on antibiotic use in India. So after screening more than 10,000 publications, I identified 48 studies from 27 countries and found that on average, 50% of patients attending primary care clinics receive antibiotics. But only 9 studies assessed the appropriateness of prescription, giving heterogeneous results. What is clear is that we have a problem. In fact, a considerable proportion of these studies had major methodological limitations and were considered to be low quality, thus making the estimates on antibiotic prescribing and especially on inappropriate prescribing even less reliable. An alternative approach that overcomes many of these limitations is the use of simulated patients. These are healthy individuals who are recruited from local communities and extensively trained to portray a predefined clinical condition to healthcare providers, thus allowing to measure actual practices. These fake patients are indistinguishable from real patients. They go to the doctor's office, and after that, they are interviewed in order to collect information on providers' behaviors, on their recommendations, on treatments that were prescribed, or tests that were ordered. So for all these reasons, I decided to put together all data on drug prescribing and dispensing that were collected through 9 studies that utilize simulated patients to access quality of care in selected areas of India, China, and Kenya for a total of more than 8,500 medical visits, all done in primary care. And in all these studies, simulated patients only presented conditions like common cold or asthma that do not require antibiotics, thus allowing to measure overuse. And since diagnoses are fixed by design, comparisons can be made across providers and across settings. Among the key findings, I want to highlight that unnecessary antibiotics were given in 50% of the visits in India and Kenya, nearly 30% of those in China, and a large proportion of the antibiotics in India and China belong to classes that have a high potential for selective resistance. And focusing on India, across a wide range of providers, predominantly in the private sector, I found that rural providers were more likely to overprescribe antibiotics than urban ones. Qualified providers did it more than non-qualified ones, and presumptive to be led to more overuse than other conditions. India merits special attention as it is the top consumer of antibiotics in the world, a situation that is worsening over time. The largely unregulated and fragmented private sector, where most patients first seek care, accounts for the largest proportion of antibiotic consumption in the entire country. In India is also among the hardest hit areas in this pandemic, which is making things even more complicated. Some drugs, some antibiotics like azithromycin, have been repurposed for use for the management of COVID-19, for treatment or prevention, although all guidelines recommend against this practice. So to assess the impact of the pandemic on antibiotic consumption in India, I conducted interrupted time series analysis of pharmaceutical sales data from the entire private sector between 2018 and 2020, focusing on non-pediatric formulations and especially azithromycin and hydroxychloroquine. Of note, I estimated that azithromycin consumption increased dramatically during the peak phases of the epidemic wave, with 40 million excess doses sold between June and September 2020, attributable to COVID-19, and as cases declined, sales declined as well. Hydroxychloroquine sales jumped in March, with over 11 million excess doses sold. And this happened before the number of COVID-19 cases began to increase in India, suggesting the widespread use in prophylaxis, despite evidence of no benefit and safety concerns. So all these alarming data indicate that there is an urgent need to act and limit the widespread inappropriate use of antibiotics, especially in primary care. The COVID-19 pandemic is bringing new challenges, but a parallel pandemic of antimicrobial resistance cannot wait longer for us to wake up. And with this, I want to express my immense gratitude to Dr. Richard Tomlinson for his funding support, along with other donors that supported my doctoral studies. Special thanks to my supervisor, my PhD committee, all my research collaborators, and thank you all for listening.
Our final presenter is Renaud Boucher-Browning. A returning Tomlinson Talks presenter, Renaud now holds a doctorate in double bass performance from McGill University, in addition to bachelor's and master's degrees from Rice University and diplomas from bass soloist Francois Rabat. Renaud's thesis investigated the manuscript Chromata embellishments of Viennese violone virtuoso Johannes Sperger for his contrabass concertos. As grand prize recipient in the student division of the 2020 research competition of the International Society of Bassists, Renaud's article on Sperger's cadenzas is forthcoming in the online Journal of Bass Research. Renaud will present this article at the online convention of the International Society of Bassists in June. Renaud has appeared as soloist in Johann Baptist von Hall's concerto with the Boise Baroque Orchestra, and he has participated twice in the Schleswig-Holstein Festival Orchestra in Germany. Renaud.
Hello, my name is Renaud Boucher-Browning. I am a graduate of McGill University's Sulis School of Music. Today, I will share with you my thesis project entitled Reviving a Lost Art, improvising cadenzas and lead-ins for the contrabass concertos of Johannes Sperger. In my first year at McGill, I came across this thematic catalog of Sperger's works. In it, I found references to cadenzas in the list of his concertos, as well as cadenzas and lead-ins in the fragments and sketches section at the back of the catalog. These sources led me to develop the following questions. Who was Sperger and where did he live? How do the Viennese violone and modern double bass differ? How are Sperger's cadenzas different from his lead-ins? And how can manuscript evidence of Sperger's creative process help bassists to improvise new fermata embellishments? Sperger was an organist, composer, and Viennese violone virtuoso who lived in the late 18th century. Sperger was a contemporary of Mozart. He wrote 18 concertos for double bass over a 30-year time period from 1777 to 1807. Sperger's career began in Pressburg in the 1770s before moving to Vienna in the 1780s. And after several audition tours, he secured a permanent position in 1789 in northern Germany at the court of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. Here, we see a painting of this court orchestra from before Sperger's time. Notice the violone player at the back of the ensemble. This is not Sperger, but rather his predecessor. This painting shows the aristocratic milieu of Sperger's music making and the traditional role of the violone player as the foundation of the ensemble. Sperger's instrument, the Viennese violone, differs from the modern double bass in several ways. First of all, the tuning is completely different. The Viennese violone sounds like this, la 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 la, and the modern double bass like this, la 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 la. In addition, the violone has frets, and the modern double bass does not. Here are two bows from Sperger's estate, and these bows show the two roles that bass players play in ensembles. The top one shows the traditional foundational role, while the bottom one shows the soloistic role that Sperger took on. In this manuscript page, in the red box, we see the solo bass opening a rondo movement from Sperger's last concerto before the entire orchestra enters, as you will hear now. In late 18th century concertos, the fermata symbol invites soloists to add certain kinds of embellishment. Sometimes fermatas just mean a general pause, a dramatic silence. Other times, a lead-in, a short musical aside, or a cadenza, a longer musical soliloquy at the end of the movement of a concerto. Here we see Sperger's first movement cadenza for his 8th concerto. Sperger has used symbols to revise certain sections of this cadenza, and we notice that the cadenza starts with a fermata symbol in the upper left. In the lower right, we see a trill ending the cadenza. Here are 6 lead-ins from the 3rd movement of the same concerto. Notice that each of these lead-ins is far shorter than the cadenza, and each one develops a different musical idea. There are 6 lead-ins here, as well as a cadenza fragment, which ends with a trill. Lead-ins rarely end with trills. This double-sided manuscript page is from Sperger's 7th concerto. In it, we see Sperger's somewhat arduous creative process. On the left, we have a rough draft, which he has summarily crossed out, and on the right, we have the fair copy, which shows a clearer picture of his final ideas. These 2 pages from his 12th concerto show Sperger's bounty of creative ideas. On the left, we see 3 cadenzas for 1 concerto, and on the right, we see a cadenza network, which starts and ends the same way, but has multiple possibilities within it. I took this network idea in my process for learning to improvise cadenzas. I created a constellation of possibilities and then improvised within and then beyond that network, as you will hear in this improvised cadenza. Why improvise Chromata embellishments? Firstly, to express oneself as an historically informed performer by embodying the role of performer, composer, improviser, as Sperger did. And finally, to engage audiences with spontaneous virtuosity in performance. I would like to thank Dr. Tomlinson for supporting doctoral research at McGill, Brigitte Poulain, my collaborative pianist, my entire doctoral committee for their insightful guidance, and the 2 music librarians, both at McGill and in Germany, who helped me obtain the sources for my research. Thank you.
Everyone, and congratulations again to each of the 4 presenters. Those were fantastic talks. I've been told that we have a number, so many was the exact quote, of questions. So I hope the 4 of you are all set. I'm just gonna have these softballs tossed to me by Sage, and then I'll call each of you out, and we're not gonna do it in any particular order. Everybody who's watching now, this is the live segment, as if you couldn't tell. Alvi, are there other suspected interactions that involve anticoagulants, bleeding, or blood clots that deserve more investigation once we better understand the links between SSRIs and anticoagulants?
So that's a great question. Thank you for asking. There are, in fact, there are several other drugs that have in question that have been linked with potential interactions with anticoagulants, SSRIs being one of them. Some of the other drugs include, for example, a class called NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. These include commonly known drugs like Advil or naproxen, and there have been studies which have looked at interactions with these drugs. And in fact, for my thesis research, when I do follow patients, I'll be considering whether or not patients are taking NSAIDs, for example. There are also other drugs that may lower your risk for bleeding. For example, these drugs include proton pump inhibitors. These are often given to patients who may have a history of bleeding or who may have ulcers. So this is a factor that would be important to take account into my research. And these patients who are taking these drugs would be controlled, these factors would be adjusted for in the analysis.
Excellent, thank you, Alvi. Next question is for Kevin. The question asks, what conditions would have to be met for scientists to identify a planet as, quote, habitable? And how close are we to being able to make that kind of determination?
Okay, well, I'm going to answer that kind of in the reverse. We're not close at all. We're many, probably decades away still from unambiguously detecting life somewhere else. But there's many factors that go into habitability other than just the surface water I mentioned. For example, you need to have an environment where life can start, especially. So on Earth, it's suspected that life may have begun at hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, where there's a lot of energy and a lot of heat to get life kickstarted. And there's also, on the other side of, I spoke about radiation being a negative, but there's also the possibility that this ultraviolet radiation that I think is so harmful to the surface water could have kickstarted microbial life as well. So there's tons and tons of factors, and I think we're still quite a ways away from determining that in any way.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question is for Georgia. This is coming from Dr. Sulis. Was the overconsumption of hydroxychloroquine in 2020 a one-time event, or is it likely that other antibiotics might see widespread adoption like this before scientific consensus on their effectiveness is reached?
Thank you for your question. Well, so hydroxychloroquine experienced a huge increase in sales in 2020, and we don't know what is happening now in 2021, but there is probably a decline now due to changes in policies and recommendations. But for other drugs that are typically used for the treatment of COVID-19, I'm not expecting a similar behavior just because the recommendations have now been improved, and there are no medications, no antibiotics that are currently recommended for treatment of COVID-19 cases or even for prophylaxis. So this happened especially in the beginning of the pandemic period, when we actually didn't know anything about this virus, about how to manage patients with this condition. And there were anecdotal records of potential benefit with the use of certain medications. And that is why it happened with hydroxychloroquine or even with azithromycin, as I mentioned in my presentation.
Okay, great, thank you. Not surprisingly, next one is for Renaud. So you notice we've gone in the right order. We're not going to keep doing that. Okay, so we'll do Renaud. Several people actually are really interested to know how you come up with improvisations. And there's a specific question that someone asked, could these improvised embellishments be considered a precursor to jazz?
So this is an excellent question. Yes, over the span of hundreds of years, improvisation has been present in many different styles of music, both before Sprague's time, after, and in our own time. In classical music, as opposed to jazz, there was a marked decline in improvisation, especially in the 19th century. Regarding how I improvise these embellishments, I think first you need to think of a foundation of familiarity with the concerto, the repertoire, and the style. Building on that, there's intimate knowledge of the specific movement in question, where the embellishments are going, as well as the function of each fermata within that movement. Oftentimes these fermatas happen at dramatic moments, suspenseful moments. And so it's the soloist's opportunity to both reflect on the music in the concerto, but also to amuse the audience perhaps, or evoke a certain emotion, a certain character that is reflected in the music that came before, the music that comes afterwards. And so it's a combination of reflection, inspiration in the moment, and a great deal of practice, making mistakes and hitting walls and dead ends before you find magical moments that are really fun.
Do you think it's, I'll throw one in here myself, do you think it's much like today's live performance where you feed off the audience as well? Would that have been in those settings?
Certainly. And there are documented performances that Sprague gave for not only his employers, but also important audiences whom he was trying to impress. And we even have the manuscript fermata embellishments from the concertos that he probably performed. We don't know exactly which ones. So it's clear that writing down these embellishments was an insurance policy. It was a safety net so that he knew that he had good material to impress a potential employer, for example. And so certainly I think nowadays, as bass players someday might get to perform for live audiences, it's a way to connect with the audience and really express themselves and their own creativity in a way that really brings the music to life for the audience. Because this means that no performance of the same concerto will ever sound the same, because it will have the performer's signature.
Well, I think we're all looking forward to those days, so maybe soon. Next question is for Georgia. The questioner asks, could vaccines produce superviruses if people were exposed to a virus while only partially vaccinated, perhaps?
Sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Absolutely. Could vaccines produce supervirus? And the questioner is asking, perhaps if people were exposed to the virus while only partially vaccinated. So maybe you can help us understand and maybe dispel some mistruths there.
I'm assuming we're talking about COVID-19 vaccines.
I'm reading what I'm being fed.
I wouldn't say so. I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand what the question means, but vaccines are supposed to prevent the acquisition of infection, or at least to prevent serious forms of disease following the infection. And even though new technologies are now being used, such as using viral vectors, as is the case for some COVID-19 vaccines, this is not something that produces a supervirus. I mean, we are just utilizing a virus to transport fragments of another virus in order to stimulate the immune response in the person who receives the vaccine, and without causing disease. So that's the rationale. The problem with what we are observing now with COVID-19 and the emergence of new variants, I don't know if that is what this person is referring to with supervirus, but
I'm guessing they're making the analogy of the overuse of antibiotics and the superbugs that are.
Oh, in that sense. Well,
that's my guess.
I don't think so. What has been observed with the mass distribution of certain vaccines against bacterial pathogens, not viral pathogens, is some kind of change in the epidemiology of the different serotypes of different strains of a given bacteria that is circulating in the community. For example, if you're using pneumococcal vaccination on a large population, the virus finds a way to survive, and therefore strains that are not covered by that specific vaccine may find it easier to spread in the community. And therefore there is a change in the epidemiology of the different strains. That is absurd, but it's not about the emergence of something completely new or more aggressive, at least to my knowledge.
Great, thank you. Let's stay in the health theme. And Alvi, the question asks, could or should doctors have access to a database telling them which other drugs a patient is taking in order to better inform their decisions?
So that's a great question. In fact, we currently do use those types of databases. The database that I would be using for my thesis topic would be using the UK General Practice database. And in that database, we would have access to basically when patients visit the general practitioner in the UK, the practitioner would be entering all of the patient's relevant demographic and health information, and this would include prescriptions that have been prescribed, drugs that have been prescribed to that patient. So we are able to see that data. So we're able to see which prescriptions patients are receiving and when. And this is just an example of the UK database. For other types of research, we also use, for example, the database from the RAMQ in Quebec. And even then, we're able to assess whether we're able to examine which prescriptions or which drugs are being dispensed to patients. And this is vital for our research in particular, because this is really what lets us assess how well these drugs perform in routine practice, as we are able to see how often patients are actually taking these drugs, whether or not they're adhering to these drugs. So this is information that we already have access to, and it enables us to perform our research well.
Great, thank you. Just for those who are watching live, it's not too late to ask questions, and we'll post the link on the screen. Perhaps it's there now, I don't have access to it, but if it isn't, we'll post it shortly, and keep them coming, because I'm gonna work the presenters. They're gonna earn their pay today. Next one is for Kevin. The questioner asks, are there any other M-stars or star systems that are currently attracting attention? And if so, what do we know about them so far?
Yeah, so M-stars are hot right now, no pun intended. They are great to look at, especially with upcoming missions like the James Webb Space Telescope, which hopefully launches this year. But they're great because they have a really nice contrast ratio with the planet. So the stars are a lot dimmer than the sun. So when the planet passes in front in a transit, it's a lot easier to see the dip. But oh, sorry, I completely forgot the question now.
Sorry, just you're on the right track there. So just what's exciting in this area now? Where are we looking? And what do we know
Right,
about
okay.
it already?
Right. So the coolest thing I think we found so far with M-Dwarf stars is the TRAPPIST-1 system that I mentioned. There's 7 planets in very tight orbit, and that's the most planets we've ever found in an M-Dwarf system, let alone an exoplanet system. And multiple of them, I think up to 3, could actually be in the habitable zone and could be rocky like Earth and maybe have water. So yeah, I think M-Dwarf, the study of M-Dwarfs and planets around M-Dwarfs is really accelerating. And I think it will more so in the next few years when we have dedicated missions actually looking at specifically M-Dwarf stars.
Very cool. Next question is, Renaud, coming back, I think you've got a lot of people who want to know how you do your thing. So this question is, can you elaborate a little bit more on the process of teaching yourself to improvise? How do you turn theory into practice? How many walls do you have to hit, I think, is really to paraphrase the question.
Okay, well, plenty of walls, but sometimes you can find a stairway and go around the wall. And, you know, so I began by trying to find as many examples as I could. And that's where the research into the manuscript was important. And it's as though my ability to improvise cadenzas evolved along with the research, so that at the beginning I had very few examples and I was not very good at improvising cadenzas. And once I learned to play in the original tuning, which is quite a process, it's like learning a new instrument. Once I had a period bow that helped me to learn more about the bow strokes that Sperber would have used and the articulations, then I was speaking the language. And the more I studied different concertos, cadenzas for different concertos, lead-ins in different concertos, I began to amass this constellation of possibilities. And the reason it's important to have the, unlike free on stage without any idea what they're going to play, a concerto soloist has a very specific text to work from. And the embellishments need to be anchored in the text and have meaning in relation to the music that has been performed, so that it has meaning in the mind of the listener. Because what Sperber does in many of his cadenzas is quote a theme from just before the cadenza, so maybe 30 seconds before the orchestra stops playing and the soloist takes over. And in the mind of the listener by making this little quotation that makes the cadenza fun for the audience, as well as the performer. And so to really break it down, once I had all those cadenzas, I took them apart and found the common structure. There's a 4-part structure, and each part has its own function within the cadenza. You have to open, and then there's some kind of continuation of that opening. Then there's a contrasting middle section, and then there's a closing section. And there's all sorts of different ways to do that. And so I parsed all of that out and made myself a sort of a game where you can pick the opening from that cadenza and then mix it with the continuation there and the contrasting middle from that one and the closing of that. So I got the sense of, oh, these cadenzas are really variations on a theme. I can mix and match. I can choose my own adventure. And that's what eventually led me to be able to take a concerto like the last one, number 18, for which we don't have any cadenzas, and which is in a key that that Sperber never wrote in before, and create new ideas and new maps of what could be done. So it's very much a process of exploration, of discovery, and I think it's really a result of deep familiarity and intimacy with the music, and also having a personal statement to make, your own interpretation, but in a musical form, not just in how you play the notes on the page.
Right, exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, as someone who's been playing guitar for a long time, I know that you can have 2 or 3 performers playing the same thing, and the style comes out just in the way that they approach even touching the instrument and presenting that. So is that the same thing, that, you know, when you get into the individual player, there's really a difference as well?
Yes, and Sperber wasn't the only soloist on this instrument in his time. There were others, and we just don't happen to have sources, or we haven't found them yet. And so the cadenza is the performer's stamp, personal stamp. And so ideally, my research is trying to empower modern performers to recreate this practice and revive the spirit of individuality, so that instead of playing the same cadenza every time, they might be willing to take a risk and write their own. There are many risks to be taken as a soloist, because you're in the spotlight and it's usually fast and very expressive playing. But there is a sense of authorship in a cadenza. There's certainly a sense of humor for creating lead-ins, and that's an important part of being a musician.
Great, thank you. Georgia, there's a question for you. The questioner asks, how are simulated patients trained to improve methodological quality?
That's a very good question. I would need probably 2 hours to explain properly, but so simulated patients are recruited in order to be representative of individuals from a given community in which the study is being conducted. And they are trained as if they were actors with the participation of healthcare professionals who know exactly how a given condition typically presents. So they learn how to present, how to portray a given clinical condition that is very common in that setting. So nothing rare or unusual, the typical scenario that is typically observed. And they learn how to behave as typical patients. So patients usually don't go to the doctor and say, I have this disease, or don't give very specific details. So they learn how to behave as real patients, so that the healthcare professionals does not understand that they're actually fake patients. And then they practice a lot, and there is some kind of test of how they perform with real practitioners that are not involved in the actual study, to see how they actually perform relative to real patients. And the good thing is that besides being very good in representing a given condition, they're also trained to memorize everything that happened during the visit much better than actual patients. So they are trained to observe the healthcare professional and memorize whatever happens during the visit, so that after the visit, they can report everything, every detail. So the typical patient usually is anxious. There are a number of conditions that contribute to modify the perception of what happened during the visit if you are a real patient. If you are just trained to be there and act like the patient, you are more objective in your when you're reporting what happened, how the healthcare professional behaved with you, and so forth. So that's why this is a much better way to capture actual practices.
Great, excellent, thank you. Next question is for Kevin, and I like this question. I'm an atmospheric scientist by training, Kevin, so I'm all over this question. So they want to know, where did your interest in studying the water systems of planets start? What got you into this? And then there's a follow-up afterwards, so we'll let you do that one first.
Yeah, so my interest in the water system really stems from my interest in habitability as a whole. I think it would be really, really cool if we could find life somewhere else, since the only life we know about is on Earth. I love sci-fi, so I think life somewhere else in the universe is really awesome, just the concept of it. So that led me to what are like the key parameters of habitability, and then like what's the number one thing about habitability, and that led me to liquid surface water, since that defines the habitable zone.
Perfect. And the second question on there is, what kind of progress could we make with studying this Trappist system in our lifetime?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably pretty decent progress. I think we already have atmospheric spectra for a few of them. The problem is going to be trying to figure out things like the composition of the planets, because you can measure the mass and the density, but it's a degenerate problem because there's so many things that compositions that could be completely made of rock. It could be ice with a little bit of metal in the middle. So we're making progress. It's slow progress. You need to combine observations with modeling and look at a lot of other systems. So again, that James Webb Space Telescope that I mentioned will be great for looking at a lot of these systems and their spectra.
Yeah. Once we can get out from under this big atmospheric soup that we're in, lots of stuff will go on. Our final question is going to be for Alvi. And the final question is, you talked about how important it is to study drug interactions in real clinical settings with real patients. Can you tell us a bit more about the benefits of this type of research and what some of the challenges are for you as a researcher?
So it's a great question. So going back, I'll answer the first part of the question first. So in terms of studying drug interactions in the real world setting, as I mentioned in my presentation, like what's important about this in particular is that these drugs, when they are typically studied, they're studied in patients who sometimes may be the ideal patient. So for example, anticoagulants were the DOACs, for example, they were studied in a clinical trial where the DOACs were compared against warfarin. And in terms of their efficacy from the trial, these trials were relatively short. And we don't really have at the time, we didn't have long-term data on what some of the long-term effects of taking these drugs could be. In terms of real-world data, what real-world data adds is that we are able to follow several patients for very long periods of time, and certain types of bleeding, for example, intracranial hemorrhage, let's say, for example, they're very rare, and it can be difficult to detect enough of them within the time period of a clinical trial to study them effectively and to get estimates, reliable estimates that would help inform how they're being used. So that's one reason among many why real-world studies are important. In terms of challenges to my research, one of the key challenges that we face in pharmacoepidemiology is a concept called confounding by indication. So how this arises is that in a real-world setting, patients who are typically receiving a drug, for a variety of different factors, they're different from patients who are not receiving a particular drug. So they could be different in terms of how sick they are, whether or not they have other chronic diseases. It could be dependent on their sex. It could be several, there may be unobservable factors that we may not be able to control for. So compared to a clinical trial, this is one of the challenges we face in a real world study. As in a clinical trial, typically patients would be randomized to receive one treatment or another. So if you're randomizing patients into two groups, if you have enough patients, the two groups would be comparable. So as a result, you wouldn't face this issue, but we do. So that's why presently there's a lot of research that's being done in order to help better control for these unobserved confounders. And this is done by using the vast information we have from these real world databases. And this helps us control for different factors that we may feel may explain the differences between patients who are receiving the drug versus those who don't. But this is it is a challenge that we do face in pharmacoepi, and it's something that we always have to address. And there's always different methods that are being studied to better control for these factors. So this is one challenge of my research in particular.
That's great. And you left us hanging. What happened to Jane?
Oh, I mean, I guess we'll find out after I have some results from my study, and then I can tell you, what DOAC or anticoagulant she got or what drugs we ended up giving her. For now, can't say yet, but maybe once this is all said and done, I'll have some updates about Jane.
Great. Well, you're gonna have to come back and tell us about it. So with that, I'd like to, on behalf of Dean Nalbantoglu, thank the four of you once again for four excellent presentations, and really this interaction, which was really an insight into your research and allowed our audience, which there were quite a few people watching, which is fabulous. A little more glimpse into what's actually going on. So thanks very much. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Sage and Chantel, Jonathan and Stuart for making this event happen behind the scenes. And with that, again, thank you to the viewers, and we hope to see you all live next year. Thanks again. Have a good evening, everyone.